Thank you all for coming. My name is Carl Hafer. I'm the director of the Rotman Institute of Philosophy, which has been co-sponsoring the conferences happening these 2 days, Thursday, Friday, and the conference happening in this room Saturday and Sunday. And as a special event, we have brought, he's come over for the conference tomorrow and Sunday, but we, at the suggestion of staff at Physicist, have organized this special event to hear Professor Jean Bricmont. He's a distinguished physicist at the Université Catholique de Louvain, and he's just an incredibly intelligent, famous physicist who also knows a lot about philosophy of science and has engaged with many philosophers of science in his career. And he is also the author with Alan Sokal of Intellectual Impostures on the Sokal affair and related issues. And he'll be talking to us about those kind of themes rather than statistical mechanics this afternoon. So please join me in welcoming Professor Bricmont.
Okay. I hope you can hear me with the microphone. I suppose you need the microphone, maybe it's better with the microphone. Anyway, thank you for the introduction and thank you to Certis and the Rotman Institute for the invitation. It's always, an opportunity for me and a challenge at the same time to talk to philosophers, since I'm not a philosopher. But as you said, I've had lots of interaction with sociologists, historians, and philosophers of science. And what I'm going to talk today is the result of reflections that those discussions have generated, let's say. I hope you apologize also for my accent, since this is a bilingual country, maybe in principle, maybe. Anyway, so let me start with some. Okay, I have to do it like this, but it's okay. So, first of all, what's my legitimacy to talk about that? I know I'm not a philosopher, I don't claim to be one. But one of the remarks is that I make that philosophers as well as scientists and historians, social historians, speak about truth, science, and so on. In fact, probably most of the students will hear about truth, science, etc. through courses in philosophy or history or sociology of science than through reading of Einstein, Darwin, etc. So in fact, the cultural impact of you generically, philosophers, social scientists, etc., is much bigger than the impact of scientists in the consciousness, the perception that people have of science. That's what I'm concerned about, and I say, shouldn't scientists be allowed in that debate? Of course, I'm only representing myself, but that's how I justify it. And of course, the other thing is that philosophy, as you know very well, is not unified. You have at least continental and analytical philosophy divide, and then it's not exactly like mathematics where I could go to China and almost use the same notation as I use in Europe. Okay, so, and then of course I will mention certain philosophers whom I've read, like Tim Maudlin, who luckily is not here, so we can't complain. And then I will also mention Susan Hack and David Stowe, who's Plato's cult I will use a lot on the criticism of idealism. And there is nothing technical. I'm not going to discuss, what Kant really meant or something like that. It's something which I'm not competent. I'm interested in the impact that certain ideas have on the perception of science. That's really my concern. Okay, that's how I started to dig further and further when I started the Sokal affair with all the discussion with all kinds of people, and then try to understand what the arguments are and what I reply to those arguments. Okay? So I give lots of quotes. The reason you can say the quotes are out of context and so on, what do they prove, etc. The point of the quotes is to illustrate ideas, okay? So we discuss the ideas, but I don't like to say, people say X, Y, Z, and then not give a single example of somebody saying X, Y, Z, okay? So I don't want to say, social scientists say this and that. I want to give you examples, and then the examples are word for word, and just examples, but at least they illustrate my point, okay? So I will organize my talk as follows. I will give example of what I consider as extreme relativism mostly in the sociology of science or something like that, or some philosophers of science, and then I will try to see what the root of the problem is, which I claim is a certain version of what I call idealism. I will define what realism means to me and what idealism means to me again, and then I will go to arguments in favor of idealism, or at least what looks like arguments, and then I will give the counter arguments at the end. That's the scheme of my talk. Okay? So let's start with things that I consider as strange or silly statements. One is by a social psychologist, Kenneth Gergen, maybe he's not very well known, but it's the validity of theoretical proposition of sciences is no way affected by factual evidence. But okay, he's not well known, but the others are probably better known in academia than anybody else in the room, okay? The natural world has a small and non-existent role in the construction of scientific knowledge. That's Harry Collins, who is a British sociologist of science. Then there is Latour, who is probably the most famous French sociologist of science. He says that the settlement of a controversy is the cause of nature's representation, not the consequence. We can never use the outcome, nature, to explain how and why a controversy has been settled. And here you see a slip, which I will discuss often, and which is maybe all idealism is about, is between nature's representation and nature. Okay? So he seems to say that the outcome, of course, the outcome of a controversy will be changing nature's representation, but the outcome is nature, and you can't invoke nature to explain why a controversy has been settled. Okay? Then Latour and Woolgar say, we do not wish to say that facts do not exist, not that there is no such thing as reality. So that sense. Our point is that out-there-ness is a consequence of scientific work rather than its cause. So they say there is something that is produced by science, okay? And then, of course, Barnes and Blue, also British sociologists of knowledge, they say for the relativists, such as themselves, there is no sense attached to the idea that some standards of belief are really rational and distinct from any locally accepted as such. So that's an idea which is very popular, that truth or standards of belief are just things which are locally, shared in the community. We'll get back. Stanley Aronovitz, an American cultural theorist, says science legitimates itself by linking its discoveries with power, a connection which determines, and he underlines it and not merely influences, what counts as reliable knowledge. So at least he's clear by saying, that's what determines what knowledge is. And then Pickering is a former physicist, an apostolate physicist, who wrote that the rate of quarks was the upshot of particle physics, physicist practice. Then Donna Haraway, who is in gender studies, feminist in gender studies, said that recent social studies of science and technology have made available a very strong social constructionist argument for all forms of knowledge claim, most certainly and especially scientific ones. I like the most certainly and especially, as opposed to what? I mean, moral beliefs, religious beliefs, I don't know. But anyway, they are especially socially constructed. And finally, that's somebody from my country, is a compatriot of mine. She's relatively well known, I think, in Belgium and France, but not here. She says, Isabel Stenger, she says, nature does not speak, claim the sociologists of science time and again. When I observe the laboratories, it is the human being that are active, not the phenomena that they study. It is them and not reality that are the origins of the knowledge that they produce. So these are statements which I hope, I suppose you will find it strange. And I will make a more general remark about corruptions of language. I think that, I don't know if you see that so often in English, but certainly we do that in French. You say he tells his truth, meaning he gives his opinion. She refused that claim, meaning she rejected, contradicted that claim. There is a systematic confusion between fact and representation or perception of facts, like you see in the quote of Latour. There are square quotes, which in some of the quotes I gave around notions like truth, reality, etc. And there is a general avoidance of using anything that sounds objective, not to speak of universal. That I think is pretty common in ordinary language nowadays. Anyway, but there is an amusing quote from the same Latour which I quoted, which I call Repentant Latour, which says the following. It's quite interesting. He said, while we spend years trying to detect the real prejudices hidden behind the appearance of objective statements, do we now have to reveal the real objective and incontrovertible facts hidden behind the illusion of prejudices? And yet, entire PhD programs are still running to make sure that good American kids are learning the hard way that facts are made up, that there is no such thing as natural, unmediated, unbiased access to truth, that they are always prisoners of language, and we always speak from a particular standpoint, and so on, while dangerous extremists are using the very same argument of social construction to destroy hard-won evidence that could save our life. Was I wrong to participate in the invention of this field known as science studies? Is it enough to say that we did not really mean what we said? That's an article of Latour where he sort of criticized the effect of what he's been preaching, particularly when it comes to anthropogenic global warming and such questions, where he says that people use social constructivist arguments to destroy evidence. Plus, it's very funny because, you know, we have had several discussions with him, and especially Sokal, and then of course the problem is that when we discuss with him, we always say we don't understand what he says. He doesn't mean what we think he says, and now he says, you know, I didn't mean what I say. So, I mean, and of course that's exactly, you know, his complaint, as Alan Sokal says, maybe not completely sincerely. He says, I hate to tell you I told you so, but I did. You know, and of course we always say that that would be the consequence of this relativism, that it would be used by what he calls dangerous extremists. Anyway, let me try to say what I think is the root of the problem from my point of view. And that's related actually also to quantum mechanics, and we'll see that in the talk and also in the talk tomorrow. I think it's idealism and what I call the socialization of idealism. I have to define what it means. But that doctrine, as you will see, is supported by intelligent and famous philosophers and scientists. So I have to explain what I mean by that. Okay? So the view that I hold, maybe you too, I don't know, is realism. So let me define realism. First of all, there is an ontological thesis, if you wish. There is a world which is independent of my consciousness, of human consciousness. And this world is structured. Okay? I very much know, I quite know, as you all know, that you were born from your mother, and the mother to produce you must have had a certain structure. And if you go back in time, and the world has to have a certain structure, certain properties that make it possible for us to exist. Then I would say that the proposition is true or false, depending on whether it reflects or not the properties of that world. This means that the truth or falsehood of a proposition is independent of the person who expresses it or of the group to which he or she belongs. Well, assuming it makes sense that somebody belongs to the group. But, you know, I mean, so it's a very strong idea that truth is not social. I mean, just truth is correspondence. I date people call correspondent theory of truth, but I don't think it's a theory, but anyway. We can know true proposition about the world, for example, through our sensory experience. So, you know, it's true that I'm now lecturing in your university and I know it by sensory experience, basically. I don't have any other. Now, of course, there are two remarks which, for the moment, you think I'm so naive, but of course, I'm not that naive. The first thing is that our sense can deceive us. Therefore, we can never be absolutely certain that our knowledge is true. For example, I could be actually dreaming that I'm lecturing in your university, and that could be an illusion, and maybe, you know, there's no way to be sure that this is not the case. And then the knowledge is human, because it depends on an interaction between us and the world, and that interaction depends on our biology, our history, and our culture, other species or other types of interaction with the same world. Okay? Is there a fly in the room? I don't know whether the fly thinks there is lecture going on, probably not. Okay, so, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a lecture going on. Anyway, so there is a humoristic version by Jerry Fodor, which says that he holds a philosophical view that he calls scientism. Scientism claims on the one hand that the goals of scientific inquiry include the discovery of objective empirical truths, and on the other hand that science comes pretty close to achieving this goal, at least from time to time. The molecular theory of gases is, I suppose, a plausible example of achieving it in physics, so is the cell theory in biology, the theory in geology that the Earth is very old, and the theory in astronomy that the stars are very far away. That's, of course, a philosopher's view of science. But scientism is, to borrow a phrase from Hilary Putnam, the scientist philosophy of science. It's all that scientists are trying to do pretty much what they say they are trying to do, and that with some frequency they succeed. I mean, that's a good summary. In a more light. I'm inclined to think that scientism so construed. Oops. Oh.
Down to the right.
Yeah, that's it.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, that's not only true, but obviously and certainly true. It's something that nobody in the late 20th century was a claim to an adequate education and minimum of common sense should doubt. In fact, however, scientism is tendentious. It's under attack on the left from a spectrum of relativists and pragmatists, and on the right from a spectrum of idealists and priorists. People are otherwise hardly on speaking terms. Feminists and fundamentalists, for example, are thus often unanimous and vehement in rejecting scientism. But the rejection of scientism make odd bedfellows. It somehow manages to make them in very substantial numbers. So I think that's a humoristic version. Anyway, let me go to what I call idealism. Idealism is actually, something you could, they sometimes call it critical movement. I mean, I've been naive, I've been what they call a naive realist, and I think it's defendable, but they would say something like this: wait a minute, in order to interact with the world, we need our senses. In order to talk about it, we need our languages. In order to name things, we need concepts. In order to have theories about the world, we need conceptual schemes. Therefore, isn't what we call structure of the world actually a reflection of the structures of our minds? And isn't the structure of our mind actually the product of our culture, the historical period we live in, our gender, or our social class? That's what the last thing is, what I call socialization of idealism. The first part speaks of a human mind which is unconstrained by social structure, and the second one is really something that got development with the social science, that it's viewed more and more as something particular to gender, class, historical period, etc. And that's sort of the challenge. And I think it's a respectable challenge. I don't think it cannot be responded to. But then the consequence is when I talk about the world, in reality, maybe I'm talking about my senses, representation, concept, or expressing what is determined by my culture, the historical period we live in, our gender, our social class. Or, that's a weaker form, that's a point of view that sociologists of science might take. In order to understand our discourse about the world, we should study first our senses, language, concept, etc., or the effect of our thought on our culture, historical period, genders, and classes. And that may be, that drives us towards, instead of saying you're just studying the world, in fact, it's all a reflection of what's going on in your mind, and the mind may be either universal, some sort of abstract human nature, as it would be taught in maybe the 17th, 18th century, or in the 19th, 20th century, seen more as a social something socially determined. Okay? Please, I was told to interrupt people in the talks during the conference, so please interrupt me if there's something unclear about what I say, but it's very elementary. Now we give you a series of quotes which exemplifies, assertion of idealism, why idealism is true or unavoidable. Okay? The first one is from philosopher of science named Arthur Fine. It's derived from what he calls interactions. He says that whatever we observe, or more generously, whatever we interact with, is certainly not independent of us. I think there is an independent reality, it's not. He said, this is the problem of reciprocity, because we observe it, so there is a reciprocity. Whatever information we retrieve from such an interaction is information about interacting with things. This is the problem of contamination. How, faced with reciprocity and combination, can one get entities both independent and objective? Clearly, the realist has no direct access to this world. Okay? That's the first objection. You interact with things in order to know them, so you don't have, human independent world. Then there's something pretty murky, but it's still clearer than the original, which is basically what postmodern literary theorists would say, I think. It's a quote from somebody called Niall Lucy, who's an Australian postmodern literary theorist, but he says the following. I think it's pretty much a summary of what you find in people who invoke Saussure. They base the Saussurean principle of the sign, which is that the relationship between the signifier and the sign is arbitrary. The structure of language for Lacan is such that language is already cut off from reality. So roughly the idea is that when I speak, of course, the words don't refer to things directly, and there's a whole language which somehow, refer then to the world maybe, but you need the whole language. And in fact, then you get the idea that the language only refers to itself. It refers to other words. Every word is defined in terms of other words, etc. So you are somehow prisoner of your language. That's the rough idea. What is taken as the meaning of any word, for example, is always going to be the result of that word different from all the other words within a particular language. Meaning then is a result of difference, and difference is a result of language as a system. Consequently, the Saussurian-based theory of language is radical because it erases reality from the system. Reality is never present in or to the system of language. The gap between word and thing is a necessary one inasmuch as language can never be identical with what it names, for example, and vice versa. From this it follows that presence, truth, reality, self-identity is an effective system that is constituted by absence and separation. The very lack within language and the very gap between word and things is what makes reality possible, making it seem present. So reality is something that appears to be present within language, but of course language is by definition cut out from any link to reality. That's another claim. So that's idealism. Then we can study history also. And we can also have a sort of internalist view of science from the study of history. This is the most famous historian of science, probably Kuhn. But he wrote this when, down in the 19th century, when Dalton discovered, it was not the only one, but he discovered atoms, chemists could not therefore simply accept Dalton's theory on the evidence, for much of that was still negative. Instead, even after accepting the theory, that still to beat nature into line, the process which in the event took almost another generation. When it was done, even the percentage composition of well-known compounds was different, because people started to express compounds as proportion of the atoms that were in the compounds, rather than the way they measured them before. The data themselves has changed. This is the last of the senses in which we may want to say that after a revolution, scientists work in a different world. So because we count things differently, we live in a different world. We can't really say, that would be a very strange form of idealism, saying that because chemists have changed their views, the composition of matter has changed. But what it means is that when we talk about things, again, it's something internal to the discourse of science, and when we speak of the composition, there is no, he says exactly, there is no theory-independent way to reconstruct phrases like really there. The notion of a match between the ontology of the theory, like saying there is atoms, and its real counterpart in nature now strikes me as elusive in principle. Besides, as a historian, I'm impressed with the implausibility of the view. So, he gives two arguments. First of all, in principle, you cannot say that our discourse about atoms refer to atoms, number one, and then he says, as a historian, I'm convinced that this is implausible. So he mixes up philosophical. This is not nobody, okay? This is a very famous historian of science. Now we come to quantum mechanics. That's the worst part, and that's how I got interested in the whole thing when I was an undergraduate student. So if there are students who are confused about quantum mechanics, and I think they're right. But so the idea of an objective real world, the smallest part exists objectively in the same sense as stone or trees exist, independently of whether or not we observe them, is impossible. We can no longer speak of the behavior of the particle independent of the process of observation. As a final consequence, the natural laws in quantum theory no longer deal with the elementary particles themselves, but with our knowledge of them. Nor is it any possible to ask whether or not this particle exists in space and time objectively. That's from Heisenberg, which was from the founder, maybe the first founder of modern quantum mechanics, and a very deep physicist. But you see, this is something which I was taught in undergraduate school. Namely, we don't learn about the world, we learn about our knowledge of it. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, if we have knowledge about the world, then we speak about the world. So what does it mean, you see? But they always say that we don't speak about the particle, but knowledge of them. And of course, Bohr, at least he quotes by one of his disciples, there is no quantum world, there is only an abstract physical description. It was wrong to think that the task of physics to find out how nature is. Physics concerns what we can say about nature. I discuss quantum mechanics more tomorrow, so I won't go into that, but I want to take some more extreme versions of that, which are also published in the literature. The first one is by Despagnat, who's a rather respectable French physicist and very much interested in philosophy of science, who said that the doctrine that the world is made up of objects whose existence is independent of human consciousness turns out to be in conflict with quantum mechanics and with facts established by experiment. I'll go later of why this is self-contradictory, but anyway, that's what he wrote, and that was. And then the best one is from David Mermin, who said, we now know that the moon is demonstrably not there when nobody looks. That comes from a quote of Einstein, who was bothered always by this quantum mechanics centered, who was centered on the observer, okay? And then there is observation, etc., like in the Bohr and Heisenberg quote. And once he asked to his assistant in Princeton, namely Paris, in Paris, do you really think the moon is not there when nobody looks? And that became a famous sentence that people use in those discussions. And now Mermin said, yeah, we can prove that the moon is not there when nobody looks. So, I mean, anyway. So usually the argument for idealism are skeptical arguments. The arguments are basically, I mean, you already saw it in Freine's argument, and there are arguments derived from the idea that we cannot know the world objectively as the realist thing we can. Okay? Now we give very respectable philosophers who make this point. One is that skepticism with respect to our senses, and that's something probably all the philosophers here know. It's a question of fact whether the perception of the senses be produced by external objects resembling them. How shall this question be determined? By experience, surely, as all other questions of a like nature. But your experience is and must be entirely silent. The mind has never anything present to it but the perceptions and cannot possibly reach any experience of their connection with objects. The supposition of such a connection is therefore without any foundation in reasoning. And that comes from a very respectable philosopher whom I actually like very much, but not that sentence, not that quote, David Hume. Let me give you another skepticism, relative to induction, popular in the logic of scientific discovery. Are we rationally justified in reasoning from repeated instances of which we have experience to instances which we have had no experience? Hume's unrelenting answer is, no, we are not justified. My own view is that Hume's answer to this problem is right. So in plain language, it means I have no reason whatsoever to expect the sun to rise tomorrow, whatever other subversion it means, because this is all based on previous experience, and this is something I have no experience. Well, then there is also some text which all philosophers must know, like Quine. Any statement can be held true, come what may, if we make drastic enough adjustments elsewhere in the system. Even a statement very close to the periphery, which means close to direct experience, can be held true in the face of recalcitrant experience by pleading hallucination or by amending certain statements of the chemical logical laws. So that's what I say, if I want to deny that I'm lecturing to you now, I can just pretend that I'm hallucinating, and then of course, the recalcitrant experience, which is that I see you, disappears. And that's what basically he meant by into dogmas. There's even the skepticism based on the theory of evolution, which is not very contradictory, but anyway, that's from Patricia Churchland. There's a fatal tendency to think of the brain as essentially the fact-finding business. Looked at from an evolutionary point of view, the principal function of the nervous system is to get the body parts where they should be in order that the organism may survive. Truth, whatever that is, definitely takes the hindmost. So that's another argument that is contradictory for reason I will explain later. Then I will give you some, when faced with that, I've had many discussions, and people say, well, truth is not correspondent, something else. So let's redefine what I call redefine truth or define truth. And one guy who's particularly good at that is Rotman, because he gives every possible redefinition. First of all, you can say it's consensus. That's more or less also what Barnes and Bloom are saying, that rationality is just agreeing with other people. So he says that philosopher on my side of the argument answer that objectivity is not a matter of corresponding to object, as I said, but a matter of getting up together with other subjects, that there is nothing to objectivity in their intersubjectivity. So the fact that I'm lecturing in this room is nothing more than the fact that all you agree that I'm lecturing in this room. But somebody outside of this room would have the announcement to the university. There's no reason to believe that I'm lecturing in this room, maybe, or there's no fact of the matter. For me, it's a fact of the matter that I'm lecturing, not just that you believe in it and I believe in it. Then there's also pragmatism, where people like Kuhn, Derrida, and I believe is that it is pointless to us whether they really are mountains, not electrons, mountains, or whether it is merely convenient for us to talk about mountains. So that's pragmatism. And he manages to combine both by saying the only criterion we have to apply in the word true is justification, and justification is always relative to an audience. So that's again, social. But then he says it's relative to that audience line, the purpose that the audience wants to serve, that's pragmatism, than the situation in which it finds itself. So it's both relative to an audience and pragmatic. Is there any truth to this? Okay, I think not. But I want now to give the arguments against. With the time, but I want to now give my response to this. But I want to start, I will, at the end I will make two caveats which are important. But I want to first say that behind all those arguments, and when you have I don't know if you ever had discussion with idealists, it's probably hard because you meet those guys on campus, every campus has an idealist. Students, undergraduate students become idealists and so on. So when you discuss with them, in the end of the day, you see that what they say is basically one of two things. One is solipsism, namely there is my mind, and there's something going on in my mind, I'm seeing you, but it's all an illusion, it all goes in my mind. Of course, I have no body either. I mean, the body is also an illusion of my mind. Everything, it's, it's maybe I'm a brain in a vat, and there are some electrodes producing sensation in my mind, but something like that. Of course, you can say the same thing for yourself. You can say that I'm an illusion, which I would not agree with, but you can, that's solipsism. And then there's radical skepticism. Radical skepticism say, okay, maybe there's something out there outside of my mind, but I have no way to know it objectively. There's no way to, all the arguments I give. And those views are, I think, irrefutable. But that doesn't mean that they are true. That doesn't mean they are interesting. That doesn't mean we have to pay attention to them. I don't think we should. But it's true that it's a particularity of human condition, and I believe really a particularity of our condition, that we cannot refute, the strong version, namely solipsism. Somebody is a solipsist, how are you going to prove that there's something? You hit him, but then he says it's just something in my mind. There's no way to do anything, okay? And then you can't wave your hand like, some philosophers do, because then you can say, well, that's just something going on in my mind. So, and radical skepticism is also irrefutable. How are you going to prove to somebody who doesn't want to believe it that I'm lecturing right now? Okay, so it seems to me, but the point is that the arguments often don't go that far. You see, people don't want to go that far. If you discuss with idealism, you can corner them to see that that's what they really say. But usually they don't want to say that because they think it's silly. So they want to say something weaker, and my claim is that the weaker claims suppose realism. That's what I'm going to say. There is no argument. There is a rhetoric of idealism. I think it's not, okay, now I'm going into what I say, I won't go into technical philosophy. I think it started with Kant. Kant, I think, tried to find some middle ground between realism and Berkeley. Berkeley, of course, was defending full-fledged idealism. I think Kant said, well, there's a thing in itself, but you only know it as it presents itself to us or something like that, which sounded reasonable and sounded a little bit like the quotes I gave. But then, in the end, okay, well, I never know exactly what it means, and it seems to me that there is no middle ground between realism and solipsism. That's my radical skepticism. That's my thesis. Okay? With two caveats later. Okay. Now we quote Stowe's book, Plato's Cult, which I think is what inspired me. Most of the argument for idealism take the form of what they call the worst argument or the gem. The gem is like this. Here is a tree there. I cannot have trees without a mind in mind, so I think there is a tree which is not in my mind, and I have it in my mind. see the tree without having it in mind, of course. Therefore, that's the point. You cannot have trees without the mind in mind. But of course, I can have trees without the mind in mind. I mean, I think the tree is there. Trees without the mind means a tree out there which is not in my mind. Which I know because I look through the window and I see the tree. Okay? You see the tree too. So, I have a tree without the mind in mind. But of course, I cannot do it without having them in mind. So let's compare with, what one might call gastronomical idealism. You cannot eat oysters. You can eat oysters only insofar as they are both under the physiological and chemical conditions which are the presupposition of the possibility of being eaten. You can see what style is imitated here. Therefore, we cannot eat oysters as they are in themselves. But of course, I think you can eat oysters as they are in themselves. Or more bluntly, there's the Australian philosopher who says we have eyes, therefore we cannot see. Because we need instruments to see, but that doesn't mean that we don't see. You see, I cannot think of the tree there without having it in my mind. That doesn't mean that it's not there. And it's always the same sophism. I will give you several examples of gems from very famous philosophers now, and I think you will see, why they are instances of the gem. Berkeley, of course, Wells. The mind is deluded to think it can and does conceive of bodies existing unthought of, or without the mind, to at the same time they are apprehended by or exist in itself. So he says it's an illusion to think that, you can, bodies exist unthought of. The tree doesn't need me to look at it to exist, okay? But it's an illusion because I cannot know about the tree without having the tree in mind, which is exactly an example of the gem. Or the quote I just gave above. The mind has never anything present to it but a perception and cannot possibly reach an experience of that connection with objects. The supposition of such a connection is therefore when yet without any foundation in reasoning. That's exactly a gem. Okay? Another gem occurs, Wells count. If we treat outer objects as things in themselves, I think the tree is a thing in itself, if you wish. It's quite impossible to understand how we could arrive at the knowledge of their realities outside of us, since we have to rely merely on the representation which is in us. For we cannot be sentient of what is outside ourselves, but only of what is in us, and the whole of our self-consciousness, therefore, yet nothing save merely our own determinations. So if I have a feeling of a tree outside, it's just something happens inside me, but there is no connection. Yes.
Can you explain what GEM stands for?
Oh, GEM is what I defined before. The GEM is the argument for idealism, which I gave here. You cannot treat in the mind without the mind in mind, without the mind in mind. Therefore, you cannot have trees without the mind in mind. You see, the therefore is when it's stated like that, it's clearly we have eyes, therefore we cannot see. It's clearly a false deduction. But the gem is just, I give instances of people who, of course, do that false reasoning. They say you cannot. But what do you mean I cannot? Of course I can see that there is a tree by seeing it. Of course it's in my mind, but that doesn't mean there is no tree. You see, it's important to realize that, as I said, there is a rhetoric, but there is no argument. Now, of course, if somebody would say, oh, how do you prove that there is a tree there and that it's not all something in your mind and you have no body, etc., how can you prove that solipsism is false? And there's no argument. But you say they don't want to go that far. It's not clear what. That's what I said. There's no middle ground between realism and pure solipsism or radical skepticism. And what I call the gem, this is an example of the gem, this is another. And there's an even final example of the gem, which is from a famous scientist, Henri Poincaré, one of the most famous physicists and French mathematician and physicists. All that is not thought is pure nothingness. Since we can think only of thoughts and all the words we use to speak of things and express only thoughts, to say that there is something other than thought is therefore an affirmation we can have no meaning. Therefore, you say, what is the therefore? It doesn't mean that there is no meaning. Now, of course, now we'll go to critique of that. The first critique is to highlight the fact that there is no proof of that. Now, there is a long response to the skepticism about perception, which I like, and it comes from another famous scientist and mathematician, which is Euler. He wrote letter to a German princess, and one is called the Refutation of the Idealist. So you see that the debate It's long before quantum mechanics. Anyway, and of course it goes back to Berkeley and so on. Thus, when my brain excited my soul the sensation of a tree or a house, I pronounce without hesitation that a tree or a house really exists out to me, of which I know the place, the size, and other properties. Accordingly, we find neither man nor beast to call this truth in question. If a clown takes it into his head to conceive such a doubt, and should say, for example, he does not believe that his bailiff exists, though he stands in his presence, he will be taken for a madman, and with good reason. But when a philosopher advances such sentiments, he expects we should admire his knowledge and sagacity, which infinitely surpass the apprehensions of the vulgar. I like that quote very much. And then there's a humoristic version which I found in a book by a French philosopher and journalist who turned out to be a journalist in the end, named Revel. But when he was a student, he was given the following exercise. Given that a rock is a creation of my understanding, how is it possible that I might be killed by a falling rock, since in that case I will be smashed by one of my own notions? Can one commit suicide with the help of one's own concept, or be surprised or assassinated by it? A problem to be urgently solved, as everyone can see. I see you laugh, but you see, why didn't you laugh before? I mean, in the end, all those guys before were saying basically the same thing. You see, and now it's making, it's coming back to common sense. I think there is some argument for that. Let's go now to something more, which is more about Kuhn and sociology of science, etc., which is idealism derived from history. And that's why I call Martin Modeling. He has a very interesting article called Kuhn Defined. Anyway, he said, because Kuhn says, it looks like Kuhn is saying that, they beat nature into line and they sort of, it looks like the chemists convinced people that there were atoms, and then we looked at the world through the lens of atoms, but we don't know if they are atoms or something like that. So he says perhaps the evidence is never decisive in the sense of showing how the world actually is. If so, then I earlier claimed that the dispute between Ptolemy and Copernicus, Galen and Harvey about blood circulation, were highly decided could be brought into question. The Copernicans, it might be argued, having accepted the new paradigm, because Kuhn has decided that in the scientific revolution we change the paradigm which determines how we look at the world, came to live in a Copernican world, but the Ptolemaic astronomers would never have experienced the supposedly decisive evidence. Similarly, Aristotle could not have experienced the world as refuting his cosmology until he had already accepted the new paradigm, but at that point the choice would already have been made, and so would not be induced by the evidence available given the new paradigm. The obvious objection to this strong reading of the form incommensurability, because Kuhn says different paradigms are incommensurable, so you can't compare them because they give different views of the world and they have different languages and so on. And so that's how we get into this whole relativistic view of science, is that it is silly. If presented with a moon rock, Aristotle would experience it as a rock and as an object with a tendency to form. He could not fail to conclude that the material of which the moon is made is not fundamentally different from terrestrial material with respect to its natural motion. Similarly, ever better telescopes reveal more clearly the faces of Venus, irrespective of one's preferred technologies, and even Ptolemy would have remarked the apparent rotation of a Foucault pendulum. The sense in which one's paradigm influences one's experience of the world cannot be so strong, that's the point, as to guarantee that one's experience will always accord with one's theory, else the need to revise theories will never arise. You see, the reason we revise theories is because there were empirical difficulties, and the new theory accumulated. Maybe Galileo was, not completely honest and was playing tricks, etc., in the poor church and so on. You heard all kinds of things against Galileo now, who was, cheating everybody. But nevertheless, now we have evidence for what Galileo said, which we think is true, which is far surpassing anything that Galileo did this time. Okay? But then he goes on to say the following. Perhaps the appearance of success and progress of science is an illusion, the ultimate propaganda produced by the winner. Of course, the successful paradigm will regard itself as being right, will proclaim to the world that it tells the truth, will manufacture evidence of its correctness, but perhaps this is merely the will of the stronger, not the voice of nature, which really is what people quoted before think that. But no acceptable argument could possibly lead to such a conclusion. After all, we have much stronger, direct, irrefutable evidence than the outward traits, that the blood circulates, that matter is made of atoms. Then we are bound to believe any epistemology or account of scientific practice. That's a very important point. Like you repeat this in the Frogs, the social constructivist can find all its work in one part of the balance and climbing with his family and friends as well, while Foucault or Harvey or Cavendish outweighing on the other side with a scrap of paper from a laboratory journal. I mean, the question is, you know, I will summarize that later, but the problem is that if you take history or sociology to undermine the validity of science, by studying history, as Kuhn says, as a historian, you know, the idea of a correspondence with reality seems to be implausible to me. So history teaches him that. But history is also a science. How does he know anything about the 17th century or any other century? How does he know anything about, you know, he has to look at the archives, he has to study the documents, and he has to infer conclusions from that. But that's exactly what scientists are doing. He's not doing anything else. And of course he has to believe in objective reality. It's not a solipsist. I mean, he has to believe that there was a matter of fact about the 19th century that they existed, because the solipsist that the past didn't exist. I mean, you see, it sort of seems to be that once you get down to not the radical form of solipsism, then you try to use this kind of historical argument, then you have a straight competition. Where is there more evidence? Is there more evidence for Kuhn's view or for the view of the atomists, let's say, or any other scientific paper? What about idealism derived from quantum mechanics? Is the Trump form below? I'm just repeating now, you know, the moon is not there when nobody looks. Well, that's very easy to refute, because science is based on experiments. So science presupposes objects whose existence is independent of human consciousness, like the moon or any measuring device. I mean, if you say, why should I believe quantum mechanics in the first place? There's already an account for, you know, all kinds of things, spectral rays and God knows what, I mean, tons of chemical reactions and so on. Okay, but the evidence for that is based on the fact that I think there is a consciousness independent world. If my consciousness can actually modify the result of experiments, then, or create the result of experiment, then I don't see why I should believe in quantum mechanics in the first place. Okay, the general argument is this. I will almost at the conclusion already, but so the general argument is this. Either it's an argument for radical skepticism or solipsism, then I think you treat it with carelessness and attention. That's also Hume, by the way, in the same book. Even though he gives an argument, I think a bad argument for idealism, a gem, he also says that, you know, we can't refute it, but we don't care about it. Or else, it relies on specific claims about our means of perception, our concept, our mode of thinking, our experimental apparatus, our history, our evolution, like in Churchland. And then it presupposes that objective knowledge is possible. Namely, it presupposes the truth of realism. Take Rorty, for example. Rorty presumes that we know what the real consensus is. How do you know what the consensus is? It's not by asking people. But then it's an objective fact of the matter, what the consensus is, what the Canadian population think, or what do you think in this room, etc. These are objective facts. Or he thinks that we know what is really useful when he gives a pragmatist view. So in fact, you see, you're always assuming something true, objectively true, but maybe not about the natural world, about the social world, or the history, etc. Okay? And it could be an argument for specific skepticism. For example, if you study history or sociology or perception, you could undermine the trust in natural science. After all, we study perception and we know when perception fails us. That's usually taken as an argument for idealism, it's an argument for realism, because the people who study perception assume that there are facts of the matter about perception. For example, you could see a painting that looks three-dimensional, okay? But why do we say it looks three-dimensional? Because we know that it's two-dimensional, we can touch it, there are other senses that allow us to know that. So we can actually know that these things are illusions. So we can make distinction between realism and illusion, I mean reality and illusion. Then of course the problem of priority, which was raised by Morgan. What do we know best? Physics or history, sociology, psychology or perception, etc. If you are really using these things to undermine the reliability of natural sciences, I think the implicit assumption of social science is that we know best is ourselves by introspection. We are human beings and we have a way to know ourselves by introspection, to know about our jealousy, our lust for power and things like that. But that, I think, is an illusion. I think the illusion is to think that the evidence that we have from introspection is superior to the objective evidence that we have from natural sciences. And that's implicit in many of the quotes by Latour, which are not arguments for radical skepticism, solipsism or something. They are for a specific skepticism based on the study of social sciences that undermine the reliability of natural sciences. There's a good summary by Paul Bogosian, who's also a philosopher. The intuitive view is that there is a way things are that is independent of human opinion, and that we are capable of arriving at beliefs about how they are that are objectively reasonable, binding on anyone capable of appreciating the relevant evidence, regardless of their ideological perspective. Difficult as those notions may be, it is a mistake to think that philosophy has disclosed any reason for abandoning them. I think that's exactly the right statement. Everything I said before is exactly what I said about realism. Okay? That's exactly more or less my summary of realism. And since these notions are difficult, I agree that they are difficult, but I also think it's a mistake to think that philosophy has disclosed any reason for abandoning them. And that's, I think, is more or less. Okay, now we come to two important caveats of totally different nature. And I should tell you, because I gave this talk already some time ago in Lausanne, and Tim Holden was there, so he's not here now, but he didn't quite agree with the first one, I think, or maybe not even with the second, so we can discuss that tomorrow. But one is, what about unobservable entities in natural sciences? Okay? This is something which has been puzzling people ever since Newton introduced forces. You see, you can say, are forces real? Do they really act instantaneously at arbitrary distances? That's something, that's the famous sentence of Newton saying, hypothesis non finito, I don't forge hypothesis, is coming from a letter to Benjamin, where he says, you know, it makes no sense to think that these things, that you have action at a distance, instantaneously, unmediated through space. So if I move my arm, okay, I influence instantaneously the motion of every other body in the universe, of course, in a way which is imperceptible, but in principle, everything changes according to Newton mechanics, so that's strange. For example, you can also worry about electromagnetic fields really propagating vacuum. I mean, is it true that, for example, right now in this room, there are, you know, waves from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation or something like that? Well, you would think there is, because you put a TV and then, you know, connect it, you will see things. But is space-time really curved? We had this discussion this afternoon. Is the wave function real? Okay, that's a long discussion. Of course, many philosophers of science spend their time doing that, so I can't answer too quickly. But to me, the problem is not really whether they are real, because, okay, there is a problem of underdetermination. For example, you could describe classical mechanics to a Lagrangian, Hamiltonian, the forces and so on, and you can discuss which one is real. Maybe only the trajectories are real. You can discuss that. That's one thing. But then, the problem for me is that often they are not representable to us or understandable intuitively. We had this discussion yesterday about Maxwell. That, you know, Maxwell wanted to have a mechanical view of electromagnetism. I think everybody, Descartes wanted to have a mechanical view. By mechanical, I mean things by contacts and, you know, like wheels and things going around in a sort of representable way, something which you understand from a macroscopic experience of the world. And that is impossible. That's not due to quantum mechanics, that Newton understood that. You see, that's important to realize that quantum mechanics didn't change that. I mean, it's not. Newton understood that he had to postulate mathematical equations with mathematical concepts that are not defined or understandable in intuitive terms through, you know, action, you know, by collisions and so on, mechanical in the sense of Descartes. And that's, I think, is where, to come to the discussion yesterday, it's part of where the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics enters. Because we can use then something which is not our intuitive understanding of the world, but namely our mathematical faculties, to represent mathematically certain objects which we cannot understand intuitively. And that, I think, is an important point. And the second caveat, that's a sociological problem. That's, I think, is what is really behind the crazy statement I gave, at least the charitable interpretation of the crazy statement I gave in the beginning is what I'm going to tell you. The point is that if you are an ordinary citizen, as we all are, except in our specialty. I am an ordinary citizen. But how do I decide about anthropogenic global warming, genetically modified organism, nuclear energy, etc.? I mean, these are social questions people ask all the time. Well, I need to rely on experts, because I mean, that's true for everything. I mean, I never check that they were dinosaurs. I mean, I trust the expert to tell me they were dinosaurs. I never check the motion of planets, even though I taught classical mechanics, because, you know, I trust people who have looked at the planets. I never looked at the planets, or the atoms, or whatever. But then, there is a question of which expert do you trust, or why? Because there are experts in astrology, to put it. I mean, every pseudoscience has experts. Okay, they have diploma, everything. So which one do you trust and why? And that is not a philosophical question. That actually involves a certain degree of, I would say, commonsensical sociology of science, an evaluation of the past successes of the field. Then you have to say, okay, I trust medicine because I see the success of medicine, but I don't trust astrology because I've never seen any success of astrology or something like that. But you have to do this reasoning all the time. And that's maybe what is behind all this business, that there is a social knowledge. You have a certain knowledge of the scientific world, which actually is very different depending on whether you have, like you, in a university, have certain acquaintance with scientists, or really the man in the street who probably thinks it's all crooked up and creationists would say, well, but this, all the scientists are secular and they don't like religion, and they made up all the thing, to attack religion. That's maybe a silly argument, but certainly an argument which relies on the distrust that they have with respect to science. And that, I think, is a very complicated question to which there is no easy answer, at least in some cases. Okay? And we had a discussion yesterday, for example, about anthropogenic global warming, and the issue in the end boiled down to whether we should trust the IPCC or listen to dissenting experts, etc., etc. And this is a very complicated question, and that's the real question that people have. But it's not solved either by idealist argument or by anti-idealist argument. Okay? So that's what I think is the final point. Thank you.
We have some time for questions for Professor Bricmont. I'm very sympathetic to your general outlook. I want to maybe criticize one argument and then give a slight twist to it that you may prefer. This was the one due to modeling, which I hadn't seen before.
Because it exists, I think the article actually was published only in French, I think.
But this is about the hierarchy of, and I take it the implicit assumption is physics is a lot more reliable than sociology or psychology. Generally, I believe that, but I can think of lots of examples where I'm not so sure. So let me give you one. So take Carl here. He's standing in front of a pool table, billiards table, and I might know all the Newtonian dynamics, but I have no idea where the balls are going to end up after he hits them. But I'm extremely sure about which shot he's going to make. I look at the pool table, I think he's going to hit that ball, and he's going to try to knock this one in the corner pocket. And he's an extremely complex organism, and yet I'm very good at predicting this.
But it's not contradicting science. You see, that's
no, it's not contradicting science.
No, that's the whole point, you see, which is that the argument from Kuhn were actually, I mean, this was an argument about skepticism, using sociological knowledge or historical knowledge to undermine the credibility of science by giving this impression that he says that that the ultimate success is only an illusion, the ultimate propaganda produced by the winner, and that I think is indefensible.
No,
you're right.
I was actually paying attention to the hierarchy argument. That's the one I was down to that.
Yeah, but it's the one I discussed the
I mean, where physics is much more reliable than psychology. I mean, generally, I'm inclined to believe, but there's a lot of common sense psychology that I have a hell of a lot more faith in than some parts.
Sure, I completely agree with you. But the point is that, you see, you have this objective study of history. First of all, you presuppose there is objectivity because you study documents and you believe that they mean something, etc. So you're just in the same boat as the natural scientists. So there's no idealist argument to defend you. And then there's you say, okay, but we've seen how the whole society was working in the 17th century, so why should we trust those guys? And that I think more than gives the answer that the ultimate success of science is not just the last word of the propaganda of the winner, and of course we have much better arguments for Galileo and Harvey and all those guys than they had at their time, or Dalton in atoms. I mean, how did you doubt the existence of atoms? But when Perrin wrote his book about atoms, he gave, I don't know, I forget 17 different proofs of the existence of atoms. That was long after Dalton, at least half a century or something. So that's what I'm saying, when you have the direct competition between the two, and I completely agree with you that if you want to study motion of aggregates of atoms which are called human beings, then of course you should not use physics, but you should use your common sense of, I mean, it's just enough if he says I'm thirsty and I'm going to get water, then of course that explains why he gets some water and not studying the laws of motion, of course.
But I was going to give a slight twist, which you might like a lot. There was a big fight between Bloor and Collins a number of years ago about how to understand what they were doing themselves. And Bloor says, of course, everything I say about relativism applies to everything I say. And Collins said this is ridiculous, and he wanted to be an anti-realist at the physics level.
But realist at the
sociological
exactly.
level. Yeah. And
that I think doesn't work. I know. He's I know there is this difference. Bloor is inconsistent, and then
no, he's consistently just crazy.
Yeah.
Collins sees the problem, but he can't get out of it. Yeah.
No, but I think I've heard Latour. I mean, Latour, I've had discussion with him, and of course, at one point, he did, of course, hold that view.
Yeah.
That, that it's the. I mean, after all, you could use, I don't know, you could undermine certain discourse by studying, the sociology of certain discourse. You could relativize them, religion, political views, etc. It's okay. You think that they are only, liberal and conservative, with other countries with different tradition, different views, etc., different stuff, you could study history and so on, and then you have to argue for why those views are better. But I mean, obviously, I'm not saying that you could not, but the problem is when you go to undermine, and as I think is the goal of the strong view of sociology of science, which I think is pretty much widespread in society, because the view that is fed to students through their courses, I'm not talking about the courses of analytical philosophy, but especially in my continent, let's say, it's pretty widespread. There's also American universities, and not Canadian ones, but American universities through humanities courses, etc. The sort of philosophy they get is totally relativist and is based on idealistic arguments.
Robert?
Yeah, my question was closely related to this, actually, because you could give obvious reasons why sociologists of science would defend the idea that there's something privileged about this approach, right? But when Kuhn says, well, we objectively know from history that there's no objective knowledge of the world described by the natural sciences, that seems really bizarre. I don't want to defend that view, but I would just suggest a sort of diagnosis of it. But I mean, part of the idea goes back to the question of unobservable entities, right? I mean, if you have this notion that, well, the natural sciences postulate unobservable entities, and it's a contingent matter of history and sociology which of these pictures they choose to represent this unobserved world, then I think that partly explains this notion that we have an objective science of history, but not of physics. On the other hand, it shows a real lack of understanding of the kind of empirical reasoning, like Perrin's, for example, that goes into like that of Perrin. It shows a complete lack of understanding of the reasoning that goes into our picture of the unobservable.
Yes, but of course it's unobservable and unobservable. To what extent are atoms unobservable? Maybe they are more observable now than they used to be. Of course, then there are also things which are, have to do with evolution, have to do with biology and so on. And where this question of unobservable entities does not really occur. I mean, are blood cells unobservable? I don't know you would say that. You see, I mean, but you may have neurons unobservable, something not. But maybe when they were postulated, they were not observed directly. I don't know. But you see, I think also observable is has to do with our relationship with the world. I mean, are stars observable? Some people would say they are, some people would say they are not, because you use telescopes and observable always depends on means, and then you can go into the version of the gem saying because you use the means and you don't get the goal. My point is that it seems to me that of the two versions that you say, Barnes and Barnes and Blue, I guess, and Collins, okay?
Yeah.
None of them is defensible because one's runs into this straight conflict that Rotman points out, which is where there are more evidence for history or basic physics. I'm not speaking about string theory, for example. String theory may turn out to be wrong, and you can't say that that's like atoms or well-known physical theories. But then that's the straight competition, or else you go into incoherence, you apply to yourself this sort of relativistic reasoning, and then you get the usual paradoxes. Yeah, I think that's something.
Okay.
Thank you for that. It was really, entertaining, and I think you're right. I think you're both like I'm really sort of in principle in agreement with you about so much of it, but I don't know. I think I want to.
That's too afraid. That's to scare the speaker if you speak.
I know.
If you say something I don't like,
no, it's still playing in my head.
Okay.
Maybe we should do without the light. Maybe we should do without your theory.
Yeah.
I think I want to say that nevertheless, I think I'm sort of a bit more sympathetic to you about than you do. Sort of some aspects of the sort of the idealism that you were sort of presenting, and I guess there are two things I want to say. So one of them, I mean, is it not? You can sort of mock idealism, and of course it does, in some sense, seem to have ridiculous conclusions. But it seems that nevertheless, it just is a profound fact about our experience that we do live behind this veil of perception.
Sure.
And it was in some sense a profound empirical, philosophical discovery that sort of direct realism, if you like, is false, and it remains a very profound personal sort of discovery. When you figure this stuff out for the first time, when you're reading sort of Bertrand Russell or whatever it is when you're 18 and you figure it out. I mean, so I think you're right to say something. You say things like the rock, and of course, wouldn't the rock, if you think that the bus is just a bundle of perceptions, then shouldn't we walk out in front of the bus? And of course, this is a ridiculous sort of thing to think, and everybody thinks, this is a problem to be solved. I mean, Kant, for example, was an idealist, obviously, but postulated that there was there were phenomena that we couldn't know, but there was an external world and it existed. But it's not going to go, the recognition of that fact doesn't make the fact that we have really no idea how to justify that in some sense just go away. I mean, sort of later idealists actually, after Kant just said, well, get rid of this thing. It's actually what you get is a more consistent view of the world, and insofar as you value consistency, then...
Consistency? Being a solipsist?
Well, in some sense, yes, actually. So of course it seems like a ridiculous conclusion, but the point is the fact that it's ridiculous and we know that it's wrong doesn't mean that there isn't this profound fundamental philosophical problem about how it is that you ultimately justify.
No, that I agree. So I said, you see, first of all, I said at the beginning when I defined realism that I admit that our perception are, fallible, and so I agree with fallibilism. Every single perception I have could be false, and of course all of them could be false, and then we go into radical skepticism or idealism, or solipsism. So I agree with that. And I agree that, when I learned quantum mechanics, I also realized that solipsism couldn't be refuted, they were somewhat related, and it was a big shock to me, I never thought of that before. But, once you realize that, you do treat it with, you say, okay, if you find an argument to refute solipsism beyond the common sense view, then I'd be happy to hear it. I think people have thought about it since ever, and they haven't found an argument. What I'm objecting to is what I call idealistic rhetoric, which is using skeptical sounding argument, but in the end, rely on objective knowledge. Like Rorty thinks he knows what consensus is. Rorty thinks he knows what usefulness is. Kuhn thinks what history tells us. All these guys in the end accept that there is an objective reality, except it tends to be social rather than natural. But nevertheless, they all accept that there is some outside world. I mean, if I see that, half of the Canadian population thinks X, Y, Z, well, how do I know that? By making polls, for example, or looking at election results. But, these are objective factors, the same way that people think they're atoms. You see, that's what I'm saying. It's the rhetoric which I don't like. And I think a lot of it is rhetoric. And also there is this sort of proof, okay, because one thing is to say that you can't refute solipsism, but then there is also the so-called proof of idealism, which are given by Berkeley, by Kant, by Poincaré, and so on. And all these so-called proofs are pure gems, to use the language of Stone. I mean, they are pure circular reasoning, so there is no proof on the other side. And they pretend that they have proofs, or they give the impression that they have proofs, and the proofs are always of the same thing. I can't have trees without the mind in mind, without having them in mind, that's nothing that therefore is wrong. So I think it's worth pointing that out, that first of all, the argument for this idea that we cannot get out of our perception and languages, etc., get nowhere, and often the people who speak like that actually do accept an objective real world which tends to be social rather than natural. But then they are just on the same boat. But you had another objection.
No, I'll go back with you.
Sorry?
I'll go back with you.
Okay.
I'm very much in sympathy with what you said. Just a little remark first. Alan Musgrave, he has actually made a lot of use of the gem argument, the stove argument, and he's coined this expression in the hyphenated entities. So we cannot have the tree without the mind in mind, with hyphens in between.
Yeah.
So the interactions with objects are not objects which are independent. So the hyphenated entities is part of the gem. You hyphenate an entity and you make it dependent apparently on what you think about it or your perceptions of it. It's not a question, it's actually a call for a comment. I mean, how do you explain the popularity of these views outside philosophy? Because in philosophy, presumably, you are trained to think about these questions, okay? And it's part of a conceptual exercise, and you might have some value in thinking. For instance, in philosophy, idealism is presented, and rightly so, as a reply to skepticism. So, you collapse the gap between the mind and the world, and thereby you answer the skeptical answer, how can you know if there is no gap to be bridged? And that's a philosophical argument, which, I disagree, but so outside philosophy, in popular culture, in various departments in academia and outside academia, how do you explain the popularity of these views?
Well, there are various answers, but now we are getting into pure speculation. I don't claim to have any scientific answer to that. But one obvious answer is that it's obvious that social scientists will think as their science as being objective, or they would like to be objective, and then they would say it's more, there would be some would not try to get into competition with natural sciences, but I've heard that too very explicitly saying, we've been told that chemists and physics and so on, these are hard sciences and we are doing soft sciences, but the soft sciences can actually put in question the hard sciences. It's of course hubris if you wish, but that's sort of human. That's one reason. Okay? And then of course there is this very strong sentiment that we know the human world better than we know the natural world for the reason you said. In many instances you don't need to do the physics in order to know what human beings are going to do. And if you are interested in human beings and you don't care about atoms, like mathematics and so on, it's very natural to think that you have a better understanding of the inner working. When you read books, and then you get an intuitive view of what was going on in the whole society in the 17th century, which is based on your intuition of human relations. This was all a power relation, and Hooke and Newton and so on, they were doing so and so. And that's very plausible. It's much more easy to learn these things or to understand these things at a certain level than to understand Newton's equation. And I think it's, I don't know if you know Pascal's, probably you can hear it, the distinction between the spirit of geometry and the spirit of, what do you call that in English? It's pretty finesse, it's pretty geometry. This distinction that Pascal made between, mathematical or analytical reasoning and then sort of intuitive reasoning, and one is much more common than the other. And then there is a general, tendency to discuss the natural sciences, which are due to all kinds of reasons having to do with ecology, politics, and so on. That's complicated business again. So, I guess and I say, just to answer our question, you see, again, I emphasize that it's very sort of, strong. There is a strong. There is this impression that we are cut off from reality. If I don't believe in my immediate perception, if I don't believe there is a, more or less empty orange juice here when I see it, then of course I can start being skeptical about everything. And of course, then you can reflect and say, how do I have the proof of that, etc. And you can sort of worry about these things. So it's a natural human condition to have this impression to be cut out from the real world and have no direct access to it. And then, for example, there is also, you will see that among physicists, we discuss that tomorrow when we discuss quantum mechanics, that among physicists you often see the attitude that retreating to idealism is a careful attitude. That's sometimes called positivism. People, you would say something, you think the electron is here or there. They say, well, it's neither here nor there. Then I say, what do you mean? You really think it's neither here nor there? Well, I don't know. Then instead of saying I don't know, which is the case, but there is a fact of the matter, because I would say there is no fact of the matter. It's a confusion between epistemology and ontology, but it's a very convenient one. It's sort of a way to retreat between statements that you think are unassailable. Like probably Rorty thinks, okay, we finish. Probably Rorty thinks it's more instead of asking whether there are mountains, it's more careful to just ask whether it's useful to speak about mountains. But in the end, once you think about it, you have to know what is useful, and that's not so easy either.
So we have a few other people wanting to ask questions. We have still have time. Wayne?
Okay. I actually have a comment, or maybe it's a speculation, and it ties in with what Stafford was saying. I think it's worth asking why these views are so popular. You quoted Kuhn, and it's one of the most widely cited books, and Barnes and Bloor's book was very popular. And I think, or say my impression is just sort of the sociological fact that young people, high school students or undergraduates, a lot of them go through a phase where they're very much attracted to these ideas.
Yeah.
And I wonder if, in part, it has to do with the way they're educated, and if unintentionally the way science gets taught prepares the ground for this. And here's what I mean, is that in high school and to a large extent in undergraduate science classes, you're just told, here are the things we want you to know. And there's very little talk about the process by which scientists came to believe them. There's occasional mention of an experiment here or there, as if this one experiment does it. Occasional mention of views that have been what were once accepted but rejected, but they're very often actually a caricature of the actual view. And I think what happens is that when you start actually looking at how science works or looking at history, you realize, first of all, it's a lot more complicated than that. The process by which physicists came to believe in atoms was actually a fairly long and complicated one. And I think also a lot of students are shocked to realize that it's fallible. And it's almost like when the kid first realizes that mom and dad are human and not infallible. There's this period where you get really mad at them, and you feel like you can't trust anything. I think the large reason for why that whole structure of scientific revolutions exists is that Kuhn was a physicist who was trained in more or less the usual textbook tradition. Only after he got his PhD in physics did he actually start, and was teaching history of science at Harvard. He actually has to go read history of science, and I think he was shocked to learn that there were things that the scientific community once accepted and that are now rejected, and that came as a revelation for him.
Yeah, well, I can only try to defend the teachers in the following way, that I've been teaching for a long time, and I try to introduce historical aspects. We do not have that much time, you see, and then the students are not that fast, and then you have to explain the math, and you have to do the exercise and so on. Another criticism we could do is that they don't do enough problem solving, especially in Europe. But so there are many criticisms you can do, but the problem is that you can also reply that you get lousy students to start with, and you don't have enough experiments. I mean, I don't want to blame the teachers too much, and I for Kuhn and company, I want to blame the Copenhagen school in quantum mechanics, because it's not just it was bad enough in a sense that there were these two revolutions, relativity and quantum mechanics, that shattered the classical worldview. But that's not so bad for relativity, because you can adjust your worldview pretty easily. But in quantum mechanics, they really insisted that the idea of an objective real world doesn't make any sense, and they were proud of it, and they insisted on it. And that, of course, gave rise to an enormous amount of skepticism when it was reflected, including in the positivists who were, I think, half in the right place, but they were very much confused by the Copenhagen stuff, and then, of course, Popper was, and Kuhn, and probably all of them were shaken by the way quantum mechanics was presented. And that, I think, is something, more, if I have to blame science, I would rather blame that than the physics teacher.
Oh, I just wanted to make a comment on Stafford's question. I think it's a really interesting question. I don't want to sort of come across as some hardcore Marxist here, because I'm not, but I think, it does pay to think about actually really what some of the socioeconomic conditions were that, at the time, so, there's always going to be craft arguments, right? There's always going to be a Richard Rorty or a Hegel or whoever, right? And the question is why they sort of gain momentum and why they take flight. And for me, looking at these quotes that you put up, for me, they have this really sort of 90s feel, and I would have liked it if we had dates on it. A lot of this stuff is really big in the 90s, and Richard Rorty sort of had his day, but, that's really when this stuff was at large. And if you think about what was going on in America at that time, right, times were really good, right? There was pretty much full employment. There was a totally unprecedented expansion of credit lines that were making everybody feel rich, even as everybody's wages were going down in real terms. There was this feeling that they discovered this sort of magic formula with the stock market, or that would meant that house prices were going up sort of ad infinitum, it sort of seemed. And it seems to me those are the kind of conditions under which people are going to be persuaded to sort of think that, reality doesn't lie. It breeds a kind of complacency. And I just think after, as I say, Richard Rorty, he's had his day, this kind of stuff, I'm sure will be the odd department or whatever, but, I just think after 9/11, after the credit crunch, you couldn't get away with this kind of stuff anymore in the majority of.
I don't understand why. Why can't you get away with nonsense?
Well, just in sort of, I don't really follow sort of theory, but, from the friends that I have and so on, this stuff is just really out of fashion, it's out of favour. It's yesterday's news.
Yeah, but why? Because of the crisis, of the economic crisis?
Well, because of that, and it's September the 11th, and so on and so forth, right? There's a different sort of theory, the mood has changed. This stuff isn't as big as it used to be.
Actually, I can make a comment about Marxism later.
You've drawn a connection between relativism and skepticism about the external world, but I'm wondering about a different argument for skepticism, the ancient argument for skepticism, which is that if you're going to justify a belief, you have to do so with another belief, and so on. And if you're going to justify a method or a standard, which you're going to evaluate your beliefs, then again, you're going to get this regress, which either goes on ad infinitum, terminates, or is circular. And so the skepticist, the skeptic on the one hand says, well, there you go, you can't have knowledge, and the relativist says, well, you just kind of bottom out, and you have this framework of presuppositions and methods, and someone else has a different framework of presuppositions and methods, and there's no objective way of evaluating them without an infinite regress, circularity, or stipulation. And that's a popular argument for relativism.
I know, yeah.
Do you have something to say about that?
Yeah.
That's a much more plausible argument, I think, than Gemini.
Yeah, but the problem is that I think, unfortunately I forget the name she uses, but I think Susan Harkin saw that rather well in defending science within reason. She calls it she makes a mixture between coherentism and foundationalism, but I forget how she puts it. Something like that. What's it called?
Found-herentism.
What?
Found-herentism.
It's the worst technical term in the language.
You see, because in the end, of course, you don't have a foundation of knowledge. You have millions of them, which are the connection of our sensory experience. Because if you don't trust that, then you fall into radical skepticism. So I think it's again an argument for radical skepticism, because if I believe I see you and I believe all kinds of other empirical knowledge that I have, then of course I have a connection with the world. That doesn't justify atoms, of course, then you have to work more for justify belief in atoms. But to me, it's really the question that you try to, many anchor points with the world, which are direct experience. And then of course there is a question of, linking them together, making sense of them, etc. And you have to then make a coherent story out of them. But I don't agree that there is an infinite request, because I think there is direct connection to the world. Of course, that's belief in my perception, not cheating me all the time.
Yeah. I was thinking this, that even though I completely agree with this critique of general relativism, which basically undermines everything, I think that one thing that's important when this kind of critique is presented is to, at the same time, mention fallibilism, which he did.
Yeah, I do.
But then also kind of admit that even though there is a real world and we're striving for that, scientists are still kind of affected by social factors. It's not that we're completely rid of that. And given these things, then it could be better, because I think the reason why people kind of go astray, lead to these kind of radical relativist positions, is that to some extent they want to critique something that is taken for granted in the situation in some way. And for some basically wrong philosophical reasons, they tend to end up in relativism, which they should, because that undermines their own position. But often I can find that some people that have this kind of view, they kind of cut away the rods of sitting on, but still they can often be kind of good ideas there as well. And it's kind of like to communicate that. I think it's important to kind of stress those factors as well.
Yeah, but then the last one, you see, the problem is that it still seems to be that I need to know the physics in order to understand what social factors might be at work. The problem I have with those people who emphasize the social factors is that they don't understand the physics, so you can't, even understand what's going on. I mean, if there is good evidence for something, then it's not clear that these social analyses work. And the problem I have with Barnes and Bloor and Latour and so on is that they explicitly say they should not take into account the physical evidence.
Yeah, I'm not saying that.
No, I'm not saying that. But then, of course, it's obvious that there are social factors, but how do I know when they work? For example, there is a very interesting paper on the history of quantum mechanics by a guy named Foreman, who makes the case that he gives a social explanation of why there was the Copenhagen interpretation, and he says that that's due to the fact that the climate in Middle Europa after the war was very pessimistic. People did not trust science anymore, and that led to this sort of a growth of irrationalism, and the interpretation is sort of a concession that the scientists did to the general irrational climate of the time. Okay, that's okay, but you have to understand the theory before you say that. Okay, if you believe that the theory is such that there is no better theory, or there couldn't be a better theory, or it's only possible theory, then there is no reason to make those arguments. So it seems to me that you can't discuss the social factors without understanding the science first.
Yeah, but I think things were just kind of I think that would often be the case, and that people should do it. But I think there are certain factors you could discuss without kind of and do that in a scientifically good way, without kind of knowing all the details about a certain science. I don't see
Not all the details, but you have to know something. You have to know the evidence, because you see, they have to always to rule out the fact that people believe something because there is evidence for it. Because if you think that people believe something because there is evidence for it, then what they call the social factors are just out of the window. Because the social factors are always not based on evidence; they are based on social interactions, so that has nothing to do with evidence. Sorry?
There are social science experiments, right?
Sure, that's true too. But before that, and getting to the point where you're going to explain why people believe in atoms without referring to atoms, or without saying that just the chemical composition changed, like when you live in a different world. I mean, you see, you must realize that what I object to is something rather radical, but rather frequent. I'm not objecting at all to moderate version of social studies of science. But I can assure you that when you discuss with those guys and you suggest to do something moderate, they aren't happy. So that's a problem. And it seems to me that all the quotes I get, also, I'm against idealism. I mean, Hume and Kant and all the quotes I give around social scientists. I mean, that was nothing to do with it. I think the whole idealistic trend was a mistake, and I think you reflect it in quantum mechanics, you find it in all kinds of fields. And I think that's an important philosophical question, to say that there is no natural alternative between solipsism and realism of some sort. There is no third way.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, so please thank us.